So you won't believe it. I came back from Austin, Texas really, really, really early this morning. In fact, I'm pretty tired. So if I look tired, you'll have to forgive me. I woke up at 3 in the morning LA time in order to catch my flight back to Los Angeles. And then, of course, there's always trouble at the airport and all that and whatnot. So kind of tired. But the weekend in Austin was, I mean, I am a little like shell shocked. I don't know how else to describe it. I have been living for nearly a year and a half under a pretty strict lockdown in Los Angeles, California, where we were told you had to stay away from one another. You couldn't go out to eat. You have to wear a mask even when you're outside walking your dog by yourself 50 feet away from the next person. You still need to wear a mask outside in Los Angeles. So we've been living under such strict lockdown that going someplace where everything was open, and I mean not just open, but I went to a bar when I first landed on Friday night, and the bar had a band playing. I mean, the horror, the shock and the horror for me. There would never be such a thing here in Los Angeles, and the band was playing, and there was crowds dancing around the band, and no one was wearing a mask. It was. I mean, honestly, as much as I have been the person who is talking a lot about, these economic shutdowns aren't going to work when it comes to stopping the spread of COVID and whatnot, even though I have been very much against all those lockdowns, I was still very shocked. Not shocked like, oh my gosh, what are these people doing? They're insane, but just shocked like I've been living in a cave for the last year and a half. Now, Los Angeles has slowly started to open up, and according to the government, tomorrow we're back open. They're saying June 15th, we're back open. And we're going to drop all the mask mandates, although they're saying that's only for the vaccinated people. And of course, I live in Los Angeles, so there will be vaccine passports where I live, which will cause me to move out of I will not stay if that happens. It will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I will have to leave. But, there was a long period of time where we couldn't even eat outside. I don't know if there was anywhere else in the country where they shut down outdoor dining, where you could be spaced apart, especially in a place like California where the weather's really nice. I understand, maybe in New York City, they might say, yeah, you can do outdoor dining if you want to in 0-degree snowy weather, but you wouldn't want to, so you wouldn't do it. But in Los Angeles, they completely shut that down. It wasn't even an option. And they barely just opened up outdoor dining only a couple of months ago. Indoor dining, we've started to slowly trickle that in. If you go into some restaurants, you can now sit down inside, but it's extremely limited in seating. And I guess as of tomorrow, supposedly we're supposed to be opening right, back up. But in Texas, they've been open for a really, really long time. Florida, they were open since September. Idaho, where I'm from, they opened up really at around Christmas time. They were supposed to be closed down, but people weren't really following the guidelines. And I know that the bars were packed and there were bands playing, even at around New Year's in Idaho. So the rest of the country has been very open. It makes me realize how much of a sort of like a person who's, I don't know the right word for it, but I think I've come across over the last year and a half, but maybe more so in the last 6 months as like, a crazy person a little bit, especially on social media, where I'd be like, oh, these lockdowns, like, end these lockdowns. These are terrible. These are horrible. And I realize it's because I've been living under a really strict lockdown, but a lot of you haven't been, actually. And maybe you think you have. There's a lot of people who still advocate for the lockdowns. They think that this was a really good idea. And so they say, well, we were really compliant in our area and we were great. And then I find out what their lockdown measures were compared to where I'm at. And I'm like, you didn't have a lockdown compared to what I've been dealing with in Los Angeles. That's not a lockdown. And the fact that it's so varied all across the country, the fact that some areas, their idea of harsh measures don't compare to other areas' ideas of harsh measures. What does that even say? I mean, when area by area, people could think that they were living under strict lockdowns, but they weren't actually in comparison to others. So, yeah, I know I must have sounded like a crazy person over these last little while, but look, I've been living under a pretty strict lockdown. Not only am I under Gavin Newsom, but I'm also under Mayor Villaraigosa, who also is very, 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 he's been very much a dictator on the lockdowns as well. And what's really crazy is that, you've got Orange County, California, just south of me. It's driving distance. People commute back and forth all the time. And Orange County is a more purple area politically. They're pretty mixed, 50-50 red and blue. And they took a much more measured approach to the lockdowns. They weren't doing what LA was doing, except when Gavin Newsom forced them into it. So when the state did the mandates, then everyone in the state had to do it. But when the state lifted the mandates, then the regional politicians in Orange County did not put forward the same stringent measures that our local government did here in Los Angeles. And, their outcome wasn't any worse than Los Angeles. In fact, I think Orange County did a little better than Los Angeles. And a lot of areas in the country did better than Los Angeles. And when the news was freaking out about Florida back in September, when Ron DeSantis lifted all the measures, people said, oh my gosh, this is a giant mistake. He's going to live to regret this. And, nothing really happened. Same thing with Texas. Same thing with a lot of these real conservative states that lifted up the mandates early on. We didn't see all of the tragedy that they told us we would see. We saw the same tragedy really everywhere. Los Angeles, we ended up at 0% availability for ICU beds. And it was mayhem for a while at those hospitals. They did not have enough beds. And yet here we were living under the strictest lockdown, strictest mask mandates in the country for the longest time. You couldn't even use the excuse of, well, we were just too late. We started the measures too late. No, we were the first and we're the last to get out of them. So this weekend was crazy. I went to Austin and I went to these bars and I went to these restaurants, and the restaurants had every table full and the bars were packed and people were dancing together. And I went to a wedding. That's why I went there. And the wedding was packed and we were all crammed together and everybody was dancing. It was amazing. It was amazing to see people really, truly go back to normal. Now, we did have to wear our masks here and there. Like if you're taking an Uber ride, you have to wear your mask. Going inside of stores, you need to wear a mask. But it was really 50-50 on who adhered to those mask mandates in Texas. It wasn't everybody. We did because, for one, we're used to it living in Los Angeles, living under these mandates. It's like, just wear a mask. It's not a big deal. And I think it's a matter of courtesy personally, whether you think they work or not. It's like, well, it's more of a politeness, so if they work, then they work, and that's a good thing. And if they don't, then I guess it's polite in order to help somebody else feel like maybe you're doing something to protect them, I suppose. So crazy, seeing all of that. More craziness happened while I was in Austin, Texas, and that was a shooting happened at a bar on 6th Street in Austin. Right when I was walking nearby that bar, actually, I was only 3 blocks away at the time that it happened. And then suddenly the sirens went off and we were kind of looking down the street thinking, wow, somebody must have gotten way too drunk tonight, not realizing what had actually happened at that bar. So waking up the next morning, we find out that there was this shooting at a bar. I think it was called the Jackalope in Austin. So it's kind of I don't know what kind of a bar it is, but I've never been there. When I lived in Austin, I don't even know if that bar existed, or if it did, I never went. And it's right in the middle of this area. If you've never been to Austin, Texas, it's a lot like New Orleans, where there's just miles of bars, and it's bar after bar after bar after bar after bar, and they block off that road, 6th Street, on Fridays and Saturday nights, and you can't drive down that road because there's just people swarming the streets like Mardi Gras every weekend in Austin. It's a party town. I had a lot of fun living there for the 5 years that I did, but it was time to leave. So there was a shooting at this bar. Woke up the next morning to find out about this. Also hearing reports of a shooting in Savannah, Georgia, and also in Chicago. And they were saying, this is the 5-year anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting. And we wake up to these mass shootings in these places. And I want to do some clarification on that a little bit, because I think when many of us think of a mass shooting, at least for me, I think of a person going into a place, a facility, and shooting at the people, right? So going into a school or a theater or a grocery store or a bar or wherever, and you're just shooting, and you're just, whoever you hit, you're there trying to hurt and kill as many people as you can. And maybe there's a person you were sort of targeting, but you wanted the others as well. It wasn't just this one person you were going after and other people kind of got hit in the crossfire. It was, so that's kind of what I think of when I think of mass shooting. What happened over the weekend, none of those three were, by that definition, I would say mass shootings by that definition, where it is, you're in a public place minding your own business and then somebody comes in with a gun and starts shooting the place up. So in Austin, Texas, what had happened was, and there's 2 points that I'm going to make to this tonight. One is the definition of the mass shooting, and two, the implications of these shootings on gun control and how these shootings sort of changed my mind a little bit on some of the aspects when it comes to gun control. So the mass shooting aspect. In Austin, Texas, what had happened was 2 guys got into a fight at a bar. Both of them were carrying weapons, and they started shooting at each other, clearly with very bad aim, because they ended up hitting 14 people in the process. But they were going after one another. This was a bar fight gone way wrong. And I don't, it's one of those situations where I'm like, why don't we bring back the old-fashioned Western duel? Take it out back. If you want to draw your guns at each other, fine. But don't do it in a crowded bar where there's all of these people and 14 people end up getting shot. Thankfully, none of them died. I believe that in Chicago and in Savannah, it was similar situations where it was gang violence, I believe, in Savannah, where there were 2 gangs that were shooting at each other and people were hit in the crossfire, and extremely tragic. And I believe that the house where that exchange happened had already been hit a couple of nights prior, again, by the gang violence that was going on. But nobody in the community was willing to report it, willing to talk to the police. They weren't willing to give any information. They weren't willing to give any identities. It's the classic situation of gang violence that is happening in our inner cities. That is where the people are afraid to talk because they're going to be targeted by the gangs. They don't want to get law enforcement involved. And so that is what happened in Savannah. And I believe in Chicago, it was something very similar to that, where it was, again, sort of an isolated gang violent sort of event. Different than what I would consider a mass shooting when we think of mass shootings and the terrifying aspects of mass shootings. Another thing that I saw trending on social media was about the defunding the police was the reason why, this bar fight broke out in Austin and this shooting happened and 14 people were shot. It was because of defund the police. I could tell you there is no lack of police presence on Austin 6th Street on the weekends. It is the most heavily policed area in the country, I believe, at that moment, even more so than the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. There are cops everywhere on 6th Street at every single intersection. They block off that street. So every single intersection, there are loads of cop cars, not just one, not just two, but we're talking at every intersection, there's about 7 or 8 cop cars. And it's been like that for years. That's not new. That isn't something that has changed. And that is something that I witnessed while I was there. The cops were there. That had nothing to do with it. So thinking that this was a defund the police problem, that is not what happened in Austin, Texas. This was 2 people who got drunk and they happened to be carrying weapons and they decided to pull those weapons out and shoot at each other. So this takes me to the second thing that is kind of shifting my perspective a little bit when it comes to gun violence. And I know this is going to make a lot of people, those of you who are on the right, not so happy. All 3 incidences that happened over the weekend, the vast majority of the people that were shot survived. In Austin, Texas, all of them survived, all 14. In Savannah, I believe, all but 1. And same in Chicago. It was 1 or 2 fatalities. Everybody else who was shot survived. The reason was none of these incidences, as far as I can see in the news at this point, as far as the reports are, maybe things will change, but from what I'm hearing, these were pistols, handguns. These were not AR-15s or any other sort of semi-automatic rifle. They were semi-automatic pistols, but not, because nobody uses a revolver anymore, unless you really are going to have an old-fashioned Western duel, I guess, and take it out back. So they're using semi-automatic pistols, but they're not using semi-automatic rifles. So that was more survivable for all of those people. And had a shooter gone in there, now, of course, this would have been in different circumstances. These two guys are concealed carrying, obviously, because they're going out, they're having a good time at the bars, the clubs, or wherever they're going. And then I believe, now I'm not 100% certain with the laws in Texas with the concealed carry, because I think they're shifting those laws. I know they're shifting the laws on permits, but I don't believe you're allowed to take a gun in where there's alcohol in Texas, but I could be wrong on that. But nonetheless, they then had the concealed carry weapons, and then they pulled them out and started shooting. Obviously, if somebody walked in that door with an AR-15, that would have been very different, and the fatalities would have been numerous. There wouldn't have been 14 survivors. That just wouldn't have likely happened with somebody coming in with something, with a weapon, a gun as powerful as a semi-automatic rifle. And the reason is because the speed at which those bullets come out of those rifles, when those bullets, the type of bullets they're using, when those bullets hit the body, what the bullet does, a 9mm, if you shoot at somebody, it's maybe going to go clean through them. It's going to be just a clean straight through shot, or the bullet hits and stops at the bone. It doesn't tumble through the person's body, causing all kinds of internal damage, causing them to not likely survive because it's torn through their insides. Like it hits the body and then it tumbles through it. So the damage is extensive with semi-automatic rifles. So that is something I think everybody should really keep in mind when we're talking about the gun control debate. And that is, these events were highly survivable because the people were using handguns and not rifles, that they were able to just kind of carry on in semi-automatic rifles. So obviously if a person came in with like a lever action rifle or a bolt action rifle, for those of you who don't know a lot about guns, semi-automatic just means you just pull the trigger, pull the trigger, pull the trigger, pull the trigger. A machine gun, a fully automatic weapon, is you just hold the trigger down and bullets spray. Those are illegal for the most part. You can get one if you have like special permits and you're a collector or a museum or something like this. But for the most part, normal average people like you and I cannot just go and buy a machine gun, a fully automatic rifle. Semi-automatic means if you pull the trigger, you pull the trigger, you pull the trigger, the bullets fly out of it. Bolt action or lever action means you have to actually have a motion in between each shot that's fired. So there's a bit of time there in between shots for maybe somebody to tackle you. Now the power of the rifle is the same as a semi-automatic rifle. What the bullets do is the same. And the speed is the same. It's just the number of bullets coming out of the weapon are different. And so it's more survivable even if you're sticking to bolt action and lever action rifles, which would be largely used in hunting. And that's what good hunters use when they hunt. Good hunters don't typically use semi-automatic rifles. I know I'm sure I'm offending some of you, but I'm an Idaho girl. And that is what, look like. Shooting, if you're just into going out there and shooting around and you like having fun and you're aiming at targets, that's one thing. But actually hunters would use other types of rifles and not semi-automatic weapons. It's not semi-automatic rifles if they're good at if they're good hunters. So I just think that this is something that we should have a discussion about or think again about after the events this weekend. And it certainly made me think. It certainly gave me room to pause and think more about it. I've always been, when I was younger, especially, not even that much younger, we're talking like 5 years ago, I believed that if the government can have the weapons, then the people should be able to have the weapons. A very radical viewpoint. I've definitely changed my mind on that one because I don't want billionaires like Bill Gates, for example, being able to just own a nuke because the government owns a nuke. Obviously, you and I would not be able to afford one, but a guy like Bill Gates could, and that is really scary. So that is not something that I believe, that if the government owns it, then the people should be able to own it. But fundamentally, the reason why I would have that view is because I do know, and I have personal family experience with this, as much as people here in the United States think naively, and I think it's very naive to think that you'll never have to battle your own government. That is a naive way of thinking. That is a privileged way of thinking of people who have never experienced a tyrannical government. And we're not above a tyrannical government. I think that we're seeing slowly or just a shifting of tyranny that goes on within our own government. And it could get worse. You never know. I certainly hope not. I hope that people are able to rein in on the government in other ways, but you never know. You just never know. And my own family, my grandmother has had to outrun 3 tyrannical governments, or 3 governments that she didn't want to live under, starting with the North in North Vietnam, having to flee from the North to the South, and then having to flee the South after the American Vietnam War ended. And then she went to Iran. And in 1978, there was a revolution in Iran, and she had to flee out of Iran. So my grandmother, who's still alive to this day, could tell you these stories. And she's a living, breathing person today. This is not somebody from some ancient history book, although my grandmother is kind of ancient. You know, she's in her 90s. But nonetheless, she's experienced these things where people, her neighbors, her sons, her husbands, had to turn against their own government and fight. And so in my mind, that has never been an unrealistic prospect. Of course, you might have to, at some point, fight your government. You never know. I mean, certainly our founding fathers understood that principle. So that mentality of, well, we'll never have to do that, and if we did, we would lose. There's no way we would win. That is such a naive, narrow-minded mentality. The Vietnamese, my family members even, some of my family members fought for the North. Some of my family members fought for the South. They were very ill-equipped against the French the first time around and against the Americans the second time around. And yet were able to defeat both powerful militaries. And using guerrilla warfare, not having the same tactics, not having the same training, not having the same weapons, not having any of that. And the Vietnamese people were able to overthrow these empires who were marching on in. And so to think, oh, well, if it ever happened to us, it's naive. And so we don't need weapons. You know, this is the argument I always hear where, oh, we don't need weapons because, look, if you ever had to rise up against the government, you'd get crushed in a minute. That's not true. That is not true. It is not in the U.S. government's best interest, if there were something like that were to happen, to nuke its people. So this kind of idea that they would just carpet bomb citizens in the United States and that everything would go back to normal. Could you imagine? Could you imagine if the U.S. government just decided to carpet bomb Dallas, Texas? How well do you think that would go with the rest of America? Do you think the rest of America would say, ooh, they got what they deserved. They rose up. They tried to fight their government, and look what happened to them. So you know what? Let's all just fall back in line. No, that would make things worse. Governments know that. Militaries know that. They don't do that. That's not a tactic they employ. So this notion that we would never need weapons in order to fight against our government, I don't buy that. I don't agree with that. I do think it's an absolute possibility. Could happen in our lifetime. I don't know. And I try to remain prepared. But at the same time, we do have this issue in our society where there's a lot of weapons that are getting into the hands of people who absolutely should not have those weapons. And I know that there's always going to be criminals who end up with weapons, and that is a big problem. You don't want to end up, you know, where the criminals have all the powerful weapons and you don't. So I fully understand. Believe me, I am sympathetic to the arguments because I agree with them, a lot of them. But after this weekend and just seeing these 3 shootings and seeing that all 3 of them were with handguns, and that is why the vast majority of the people survived, it does kind of make me pause a bit. So maybe there's some solution there. Maybe there's more discussion that could be had there when it comes to how we can sort of regulate a bit better. But that is just something I was thinking about after my trip to Austin this weekend. So we did have another scare the next day. It was very scary. So we found out the next morning, Saturday morning, that the sirens and everything we saw from the night before were because of the shooting at the bar. And we went back to we went out for barbecue that morning, and that's where we found out about it when we were meeting up with people, and they told us, oh, you know. And then we went back to the hotel, and suddenly I get this notification on my phone that is kind of an alert for any nearby incidences, and it's a citizen app, and it tells me that there was a shooting in my hotel while I was there, 2 floors above my floor. So I immediately make sure I lock the doors, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a possibly a shooter in the hotel. This is a very scary moment. I don't know what's going on. It did say it was unconfirmed reports of a shooting in my hotel on the 8th floor, and I was on the 6th floor. So waited a little bit, waited for more reports to come out, didn't hear any sirens, didn't hear any more reports. So I called the front desk and said, this is an alert that came up on my phone. And they said, oh, no, ma'am. The police are here on site investigating, but it was somebody broke a window. So because the windows are really thick at the hotel, I guess it sounds like, maybe a gunshot or something. And maybe it was, I don't know. But they just said it was a broken window, that somehow a window. So that was that. And that was very scary to have happen on the same day that this shooting, that we found out about the shooting. And some of you know we went to Mexico only a few weeks ago. And actually getting my boyfriend to Mexico was a little bit tough because he was kind of like, I don't know. And a lot of you guys were also like, Kim, don't go to Mexico. What are you doing? Don't go to Mexico. It's really scary down there. It's dangerous. But I go and I love Mexico. And yes, I understand you have to be safe and there's areas you have to avoid. But he was in Austin. He had never been to Austin. I was taking him there for this wedding. And he was like, oh my gosh, we were safer in Mexico than we were in Texas. This is the wild, wild west. So just... that's, I guess maybe it is the wild, wild west in Texas. I don't know. But it was definitely a wild weekend on a lot of fronts, from the bars, the clubs, the bands, the maskless people, the crowds, everything being wide open, no restrictions really at all, to wild shootouts at bars, like saloons and all of that. So love to hear from you. Love to hear your thoughts on my take on all of this, kind of my takeaway. What do you think? Please go ahead and email me, kim@kimiverson.com, to share with me your thoughts and, what you think the solution could be going forward. So kim@kimiverson.com. Also, you can join my locals community. There, when you join my locals community, you actually receive a lot of these postings. It's sort of like social media mixed with behind the scenes content, casual content, mixed with exclusive videos, exclusive show segments that I'm not able to post on YouTube. And we're going to get into that as to why I cannot post a lot of things on YouTube. But join my locals community. It is $5 a month, or you could just follow me. I do some free posts, but a lot of the good stuff is for those who do support the show with $5 a month. And there you're going to get all of this great content. Trust me, it's pictures, videos, extra segments, and there's a lot more of these extra segments coming out because the censorship is getting really, really intense on YouTube. So let's talk about that censorship that is going on YouTube.